Hi, friends, and welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone.
Hello, and welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode, or if this is your first time joining us for the Heartful Parent Podcast, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here. My bet would be that given the season that we are in, you can't go throughout your day right now without hearing at least, 3 to 5 things about the upcoming presidential election, right? I get alerts on my phone, it's in the newspaper, it's on social media, it's in conversations with friends, it's even in conversations sometimes with clients where people are paying attention and worried and regardless of the side of the aisle that you sit on, if you are based in the US, you are likely to be somebody who cares deeply about the outcome in November. And if you're based outside of the US, you are probably well aware that the outcome of the US election can have a huge impact and repercussions around the world. And so the conversation that we're going to have today is about politics, not from a you should be a Democrat or you should be a Republican standpoint. But today's conversation is all about how do we invite our children into that realm? How do we help our children grow up to be not only productive citizens in terms of having a job, paying taxes, etc., but also in terms of being engaged citizens who understand our political system at least well enough to participate effectively in it. And I don't think many of us as adults even do that. In fact, as you'll hear in today's interview, the statistics are not real great in terms of what most adults know about the way that our government, both federal, state, local, operate. And when we don't understand how our government works, it makes it really hard to explain it to our kids. And I think there's this ongoing assumption that, hey, no big deal, the schools will take care of it. And again, as you will hear in today's interview, the schools aren't taking care of it. So when I first learned of today's guest and the book that she recently wrote, I immediately ordered a copy of the book, started diving into it, and reached out to her by email and said, I need to have you on the podcast. I need to have you on the podcast. So I am so honored. She emailed really quickly back and said, it is an enthusiastic yes. And I'm really grateful for that because you, my dear sweet listener, get the benefit of this conversation and her wisdom. So in a few moments, I'm going to introduce you to Lindsey Cormack. Lindsey is an associate professor of political science and the director of the Diplomacy Lab at the Stevens Institute of Technology. She's authored 2 books. The first was Congress and U.S. Veterans from the GI Bill to the VA Crisis. And her most recent book, and the one that caught my attention, which is How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You to Do It. She created and maintains the digital database of all official Congress to constituent e-newsletters at dcinbox.com. And she earned her PhD in government from New York University and is currently raising a daughter on the Upper East Side in New York City. She currently serves as the secretary for Community Board 8, and her research has been published in pretty much every political journal that you could think of: Political Behavior, Congress and the Presidency, Legislative Studies Quarterly, Political Science Research and Methods, and so on and so forth. As well as in more popular outlets that you might read, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, 538, ProPublica, Roll Call, the New York Post, NBC News, The Hill, The Conversation, and so many more. This conversation today really is just the tip of the iceberg, but it gives you a really good understanding of the first half of this book, How to Raise a Citizen, which is how and why do we need to be engaging our kids in political conversations? What do they need to know? How do we do that effectively when in many families, politics is something we just don't talk about in polite company? And Lindsey says we've got to start talking about it in polite company and otherwise. And she gives us some great tips for doing it. And then, as you'll hear, the second half of the book, if you're sitting there going, well, that's great, I don't know enough about politics to tell my kid, second half of the book boils it down super simple, and it's fantastic. So I'm really excited for this conversation today, because I hope that no matter who you are or how you vote, if you are based in the US and you are age 18 or over, it is my sincere hope that you will be voting in the next election. And frankly, every election that comes your way. Certainly this next one has big impact for all of us and for the world. So without further ado, Lindsey Cormack. All right, Lindsey, welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I am thrilled to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk with you.
You know, I was telling you this before we hit record, but I was discussing, what we're going to be talking about with my 15-year-old daughter last night. And it just really drove home the importance of civic engagement and what we're going to be chatting about today. So I kind of want to start with, first of all, and I said this in the intro, but this book, How to Raise a Citizen, which I'll be honest, I don't even know exactly how it came to my awareness. Like, Amazon loves to make recommendations for me, and I saw it and I was like, I need that book. And then when I got it, I was like, I need to talk to Lindsey about this, because I just think it's so important, especially in, we're on the brink of a really big election, and we need to be talking with our kids. So I want to start by saying, in this book, you really talk about the fact that we as a culture, and this is really US focused. I know we have folks listening from other countries as well, but at least in the US, we are failing, from your perspective. And in this book, you really explain what we're doing to fail our young people in not talking about politics and not talking about government. Can you share with us a little bit about, how we're failing them, in what ways? And I guess almost more importantly, why does it matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start by telling you sort of my perspective on this is I'm a college professor and I get to sit with 18 to 22-year-olds every year, and I teach an intro to American politics class. And sometimes people from the outside will be like, "Oh, there must be like really big debates that happen." But really a lot of it is let's just teach them how this works because they don't know it. And something that I think is just terribly unfair is that we have kids who will go to schools, either public schools which are taxpayer funded or independent schools which are funded, and we don't teach them the system that they're going to graduate into. Like when they're 18, they should understand how to participate. They should understand the different levels of government. They should know how to wield their power. I don't know any parent who doesn't want their kids to understand their own power or doesn't understand the system that they're in. That's like really interesting stuff to consider, but we don't do this, and we don't do it for a lot of reasons. And the book kind of takes this on to say, like, look, if schools could do this all, that might be great, but that's not the reality that we live in. So we as parents have to take on some of this burden and recognize our role. We only get like 4 or 5 presidential election years with our kids before they're voting eligible adults. And so we really have to use this time to show them, like, what does it mean to participate? What does it mean to be concerned? Because they look up to us for what we do and what we don't do. And if they never see that, they get the message that politics doesn't matter. It's something that like I shouldn't prioritize. And that's troubling because our politics is better when more people participate. It's more reflective of what we want, and it's something that we can be proud of versus if we say like, oh, someone else is doing this. That's not a system people want to engage in.
Yeah. Well, and it always sort of is alarming to me when I think about how quickly our kids grow up, and you're like, we only get 4 to 5 election, cycles, or presidential election cycles, which isn't many. But you also talk in the book about, it's not just about the presidential election. I mean, I know we're on the cusp of that right now in the US, but there's other stuff that goes on that also matters.
There are so many other things that matter. I think the reason that I stress the presidential election is because we know that this is the winnowing focus where media is on it. This is the time where it's unavoidable. Like your kids cannot get through the next 4 months without having something about presidential politics. But it's right. There are so many other pieces of how our politics works, and most of them are sort of undervalued in the school curriculums across the United States. For instance, most schools don't teach anything about local politics. If you ask a graduating high school senior, what does the word gubernatorial mean? They won't know. And it's just the governor, which is state politics. So there's just so many pieces that they don't get. And I think using the presidential time as like a focus and a window to talk about these things is important because we only get a few of them and we know that's when everyone cares.
Okay, I feel like I need to write that down, like to go make sure that when my 15-year-old gets home from school today, I'm asking her if she knows what the word gubernatorial means, because we are actually also in the middle of a governor election here in Washington State. And I don't know what her answer to that will be. I guess we'll find out. As you just mentioned local politics, gubernatorial elections, obviously the presidential election, and other parts of the federal government. But when you break it down in terms of like what our young people need to know, that when you see them as a college professor that they don't know, what is it? Like what's the sort of list of things from your perspective that we need to be filling in the blanks on?
It's very long, and I think if you look at like voter registration by age and voter turnout by age, it becomes clear that most of us are playing catch up from 18 to about 65 when we are all like fully participating. And so they don't know things like how to register to vote. Oftentimes they've moved to a new state or a new city and they just don't even understand how to interact with that system. Last time around in 2022, only a quarter of our 18-year-olds were registered to vote. And so it's like these know-how pieces that are like, it's not that they're disinterested, they just like can't figure it out. Oftentimes they don't know the division of federalism. They don't know what the federal government does versus the state government versus local government. And for a lot of quality of life things that college students care about, things like access to reproductive health care or gun rights or marijuana rights, that's state politics. And a lot of them are like, what are the presidents going to do on this? That's not really where this action's at. And so they don't know those things. They don't know the Constitution, which I think is, as someone who really cares about this field, it's a problem to me that we don't know the charter of our government. Many adults don't know this either. And part of
Yeah.
that is they went to similar school systems that were deprioritizing civics and government. And so it's just sort of this thing that snowballed where like we get this narrative, it doesn't matter, it's not important, and we're not going to teach you about it. And then we're frustrated. It's like, well, that's not surprising because we don't know what's happening here. And so
Yeah.
there's just so many things they don't know. And a lot of people think, once they're done with college, they'll know it. That's not true. There's not a lot of places that require you take these courses. Like you might take a political science course, but you very well might not. And then you'll never interact with that system again until you have to figure it out on your own.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my husband graduated dual degrees, but they're STEM, they are not sort of that more liberal arts type of focus or government type of focus. And I don't think he's ever taken a class in, what the Constitution says, and honestly, I don't know that I would know if I hadn't gone to law school.
Yeah, I think that's right because we don't sort of prioritize this in the way that we prioritize other things. For like every other subject, we start in kindergarten and we're like, here's some little vocab words. And then as they get older, we build into concepts. And then we get into harder things. And we might have activities or things that they do themselves. With government and civics, for the most part, across the United States, every state is a different way of doing it, but this is the modal delivery. In eighth grade, you'll get something that's like US history or US government or world history, and that'll be called like social studies. And then in the second semester of your senior year of high school, you'll get something that's called government. And that's like, what were the founding fathers? What are some of the documents that we looked at, like the Federalist Papers? And we teach it like a spectator sport. We teach it like history, not like, oh, this is something we get to do. And it's just too little, too late. And unlike how we teach anything else. And it makes me sad because we're all here. We have to, like, this is our government. We should understand it. And the Constitution's not that long or hard, but most of us have never read it.
Yeah. Yes. I think my own child has probably learned more from the script, or I should say, the songs that she's memorized from Hamilton more than she ever learned in eighth grade.
Yeah, I mean, there's like that's the power of popular culture, though. I think that sort of stuff is really exciting for people who care about this because it gives people a reason to kind of learn a little bit more. So I was very excited for Hamilton when it came out.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, as you know, I mentioned we were talking about this last night, and I was talking to her about federalism, and she went off with some lyrics that were in Hamilton. She's like, "Oh, I know all about that," right?
It's funny.
At least in that context, and then we were able to dive into more of a conversation about it.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, there's some other pieces that they really don't know, which is like primaries versus general elections. A lot of people don't know that. We see that in turnout, but you can get through all of high school and have only learned about the presidential primary, which is unlike any other primary we have for any other office. And so they don't really realize when they say like, "Oh, I hate the two-party system." It's like, okay, but in the primary system, it's a lot of different varieties of opinions and candidates and policies. We just don't really teach that much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't know that that's, well, no, I can say I know that that's not a conversation I've ever had with my kid about primaries. So we'll add that to the list as well with gubernatorial. Talk to us a little bit about, you were describing sort of what often happens in eighth grade and what happens in senior year with, you know, uh, differences from state to state. But civics education in general has sort of decreased over the years. What is the nation's report card, and what does that reveal about what our kids know or don't know?
Yeah, the nation's report card, it's a shorthand for a longer thing that's called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And it is a nationwide assessment that is administered not every year, but in some subjects every 4 years and some subjects every 2 years at grades 4, 8, and 12. And what we have seen is from 1998 until today, our civic awareness or understanding of this is at best the same and at worst lower. Like, for instance, right now, only 22% of our eighth graders have scored as proficient, which is like they know enough. And so everything else sort of shows that we're lagging. And this is like very basic stuff. It's like, do you understand the structures of the government? What are the functions of the three branches? What is the Constitution? And they don't know these things. And it's not their fault. And it's not that these things are any harder than anything else that we teach in school, but we really don't focus on it. Like, for instance, in STEM, for every $50 we spend on STEM, we spend about 5 cents on civics and government, both in terms of paying for instructors, paying for outside sort of modules that come in. And so it's just de-emphasized to a point where it's not surprising to me that our politics feels bad and doesn't function that well. It's like, well, we don't really know what we're doing. A lot of the times we don't. And so it's easier to get upset.
Okay, I don't know if that stat was in the book. If it was, I missed it when I read it, but 5 cents spent
For
for every
$50.
$50.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's shocking, given um, how important some of these elections truly are to our well-being, right?
I think it's a problem, and it's something where I understand. I work at a STEM school. I like STEM. It solves a lot of problems. I think there's great reasons to focus on that. But it's something where that sort of interest in teaching kids STEM, I mean, you even see like STEM kindergarten programs where like we're going to be teaching them science here. That sort of focus coincided with the sort of obsession over standardized tests like the SAT and the ACT, both of which have components of math, have components of some sort of science, and have writing and reading, but none of them have government or civics on it. So when we think about what the sort of priorities are in schools or the incentives, is to teach these things, not the things that are never going to be tested, because that's not the metric by which we assess students or schools. And so it's not surprising to me that it gets pushed out because that's sort of the environment that we're in.
Yeah. As you were talking or just saying that, it was reminding me, like I have a number of adult friends who are have gone through the process over the last 5 to 10 years of becoming US citizens, and what they had to learn, and what they had to be able to sort of report back and pass this test in order to become a US citizen. In talking about it with them, I'm like, I don't think the average US adult who was born here could answer those questions.
I think that's true as well. There's like 100 of them. They're hard. I don't know that I would say those are the most consequential things that people need to understand to participate, but they are sort of like questions to understand the rootedness of how we got to these places. And yeah, you're right. Most people can't answer them.
Yeah, yeah. Sort of remarkable when you stop and think about it. But I really appreciate what you just said, which is yes, there is value in understanding sort of the history and how we got here. But what's really important is that our kids, as they become adults, understand how to get involved, how to participate, and how to have their voices heard.
And also that it is cool to do so because they get the message that like, politics are all in it for themselves and the system's rigged and who cares. And that message is inhibiting in a way where our politics doesn't get better. It just lets like people who have very extreme views or very intense desires in politics to run things when most of us have sort of middling opinions on stuff or moderate views. But if we're told like, oh, I shouldn't participate or oh, it doesn't really matter, we're going to get outcomes that we don't fully like.
Yeah. So speaking of that, that it really leads to, what you essentially just said is kind of distrust in, who these people are, regardless of what side of the aisle you are on, right? What are some of the other impacts of sort of that low civic know-how or like, not really understanding the system and how to participate?
I think there's a lot, and some of them are kind of hard to put to words. One that I've been struggling with is it sort of gives us cover to opt out. If we're like, I just don't know that much, then we can kind of be like, put our head in the sand and be like, who cares? It's not a big deal. And I think that's problematic because we kind of think politics, like we're like on this little boat of politics, and we're like, gosh, this is going into really weird places. And we think we're just like passengers, but really we're the crew. Like we're running the show. And if we don't know how to do that, we like give ourselves this sort of emotional or mental cover, being like, it's not important. I don't have to do that. So that's a problem. I think the ability to be manipulated is a big problem. If you like don't understand the systems that underlie the structures of government that you're participating in, it's easy to see how you might get unhappy or upset in a way that is not true or not really, how things are happening. And one thing that I like to remember is back when we had these impeachment hearings a few years ago, there was like 9 weeks of coverage where everyone was like, "Oh my God, is the president going to get impeached?" And in my mind, I was like, "Well, unless 2/3 of the Senate is the other party, probably not." And you're never hearing that. It's just like, this is all a problem. And I think it's fundamentally disempowering. The less that you know about something, the less capable you are to be effective in it. And so if we just don't know it and we teach our kids it doesn't matter to know this, they're going to be disempowered too. And no one wants their kids to be as they want their kids to be as powerful as possible, not to feel like they're cogs in a machine that they don't get to run.
Yeah. Well, and as a parent of a teenager, and because of that, I interact with other teens. They are, I think as adults, we often like to sort of make fun of teens, and we like to talk about all the things that teens do that are weird or and we've all been through those teenage years. But what I've actually been really impressed with is that they are deep thinkers, and and I don't know that we give them enough credit for that. And they do really care. There are issues out there that they deeply, deeply care about. But what you're saying is that doesn't then translate into action because they don't know how to go from point A to point B.
In fact, I think it's more likely that it translates into being turned off or being apathetic because we talk about this in the book. There's a survey that's run. It's a nationally representative survey, and it talks about how like 73% of our kids say like they're interested in these things. It's not that they don't care. It's that they lack the know-how. Like they don't understand what's the lever of power to pull here? Who do I call to fix this thing or change this thing or talk about this thing? Or even simple stuff like how do I register to vote? In some states where you can't do that online, it's kind of tricky. Like in Texas, we have millions of voters there, but they don't have an online voter registration system. So students have to or kids have to, pick up forms. They have to use things that they're not used to using, like their social security number, which oftentimes 16-year-olds don't know. The card's still with mom or dad. It's tricky. It's like not that easy. And we sort of think that like schools will take care of it or somehow they'll figure it out. And my plea is that that's not happening. I see it every day. And New Jersey does a really good job of making it easy. So the other states I know have a harder go of it. So parents have to take this up as a responsibility.
Yeah, and honestly, Lindsay, I can't remember if I was reading this in your book or I was also sent just this morning a Substack article by my husband's grandmother that was about voter registration for those kids that are not quite 18, and trying to bring voter registration drives, I guess, to the high schools because of exactly what you're talking about. that they don't know how to go about doing it. But whether it was in your book or in that article that I read, it was saying that in the last presidential election, only somewhere around 40% of 18-year-olds were registered to vote, and many, many more showed up at the polls or wanted to vote and were turned away because they weren't registered in advance.
That is an experience that I get to see firsthand because at my school, I work on our team that is about like voter turnout. And so we have these events called Ducks to the Polls because our mascot is a duck and we like take all the kids to the polls. We don't care how they vote, we drop them off. And then afterwards, we go for an ice cream party. And so, like, that's the whole thing. But without fail, there are students who are turned away because they weren't registered or they're not registered in that county. And that feels really sad. It feels embarrassing for them. They're like really looking forward to doing this like adult thing. You know, they're college students, they're going with their friends. And then they're told, like, you didn't fill out a form 30 days ago. Sorry, you can't do this. And that's the first time they're hearing it. And that doesn't feel good. And I didn't like watching it. And it was one of the reasons that I decided to take this on as a project.
Which I'm so glad that you did, but you're right, like that doesn't feel good because here you've got this kid on the cusp of wanting to be engaged and they're like shut down on day one.
Yeah, it doesn't feel, it's not nice at all. And it's embarrassing because they're with other people who like get to do it and they're like, oh, you knew how to do this? It's disheartening all around and no one likes how it feels.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I can't imagine, especially in those states, as you just said, like Texas, or I'm sure others, where you have to do something in person and you can't just go online. Or I know in some states, I believe, oh my God, I should know this, Lindsay, I should know this. But I think in Washington, you can register at the same time that you get your driver's license.
In most states you can because we have motor voter laws. Yeah, that's probably true there too.
Okay, good. I wasn't making that up.
Yep.
Okay, so I want to go back a little bit, just sort of from a, I guess, an historical perspective. You know, we've reached this place of sort of low civic know-how, low civic involvement, which you know enumerated a number of downsides to that or negatives to that. And you talked about how we've seen civic education decrease, right? The 5 cents to the $50 of STEM. But why? Like, why has that happened and how did we get here?
I think we got here in a few different ways. Some are school focused, some are cultural. One of the cultural pieces that is sort of like hard to reckon with, but something that I think we need to do is that there are sometimes, depending on where you are in the country, taboos about talking about politics. Like it sits in an off limits bucket with things like sex or religion or money. And when we hold politics over there and we say you can't talk about it, it's really hard for young people to sort of understand what they're doing because they don't have practice in it. And so that's not a criticism of schools. That's really just like a criticism of cultures and traditions that say you can't do this. So that's part of it. The other thing is it is hard. It's not an easy subject. It's like history and contemporaneous stuff. It's like know-how and theoretical knowledge. Like it is a difficult subject. And the way that we do it, we just do too little too late. We don't give it the amount of time that it needs for someone to really understand the system. And instead, we all just end up playing catch up. But I also think there's something that's kind of new. As part of the book, we interviewed teachers in nearly every state, myself and 6 research assistants. And something that we heard from a lot of the teachers was that they themselves were hesitant to talk about these subjects in the classroom because they're afraid of parental blowback. So, like, even if they were saying something like, here's the 3 branches, and Congress is the first branch because it's the first article in the Constitution, someone can go home and be like, my teacher doesn't like the president. They said the Congress is more important than them. And then that parent inflames a Facebook group or emails a principal or administrator. And so it's just kind of hard. Like there's constraints to doing this work in school on top of the fact that you don't have the time to do it. There's not the incentive to do it. As an individual teacher, it feels almost dangerous sometimes because you're just afraid that someone's going to hear it in the wrong way, despite the fact that every teacher we talked to wanted kids to know this. They understand the importance of having people understand government, but it's really hard to do it.
Such a valid point. And we definitely seem to live in an era of parents wanting to be sort of in every, involved in the nitty gritty of everything that goes on in our schools and a distrust of our educators, which, that's a whole subject for a different day, I think. But it's funny, I was actually also speaking with my mom about this interview and this book. And she was a teacher, public school teacher for 30 years. And she said, we used to talk about politics all the time. And she said, and I promise you that not one of my students could ever tell you how I would vote. Like, it can be done, right?
It totally can be done. I'm glad she said that because I was just talking to someone the other day about one of my favorite semesters where I was teaching, and I had they have to do like a course survey at the end. And I had multiple students who were like, I can't tell if she's a Democrat or a Republican because she said this and this, and I just can't figure it out. And I was like, that's like the ultimate compliment because we know that learning settings are better if you have sort of like a neutral person who's delivering this sort of information. I think it's hard to get that done now because there's like a lot of hypervigilance in schools. And also, not for nothing, the pandemic really brought Zoom schools into homes where parents had like a little more oversight. They were hearing and seeing more. And those sort of impacts still exist in a lot of our schools where parents just they do want to have a hand in a lot of things. And this is not to say I think teachers should be like espousing political views. There's plenty of like court cases that sort of curtail what they can and can't say, but it's a fraught environment.
Yeah, it's a really, really fraught environment. So because of that, we've sort of cut back and we just don't talk about it at all, or at least not enough. And so that's where I guess you come in and say, look, parents have to fill in the gap.
I think so because no one likes how our politics feels right now. I don't know many people who think it's functioning particularly well, but we kind of think someone else is going to come and save us. And that's not true. Like we are the system, we have to do the saving. And it's not really a book that's like scoldy or finger waggy about like, why don't you know more? It's like, guess what? You were raised in systems that were actively deprioritizing this too. And so the second half of the book is essentially like a primer of like, here's some catch up. Let's like learn a little bit together so that you can go into this with confidence and just model for your kids the importance of learning more, the importance of saying like, I care about this community, so I'm going to understand how to participate in this community. Those are things we can all do and not feel bad about not knowing stuff right now. Our kids don't need us to be little government experts. They need us to model good pro civic behavior.
Yeah. I love that you said that because that was my take on this book too, that as I read it, it is not preachy. It's not scoldy. Like I didn't feel like, oh God, I've screwed up. Right. It was written really with a, hey, here's where we are. Here's the information that our kids need to know. And here's some ideas for how we can get there. So I want to dive into that, like getting there, because and you do the second half of the book is great sort of primer on these things that some of us just don't know. Like I said, I think there's much of it I wouldn't have known had I not attended law school. And you shouldn't have to attend law school to understand how our government works, right?
That's right.
But while I would agree with you that neutrality in our schools and teachers teaching from that neutral space is appropriate and necessary, that gets harder at home, right? That gets a lot harder at home. And as you said, culturally, we come from we have a sort of belief system that in many places that we don't talk about politics. And so I feel like many of us don't know how to discuss politics well. And I'll be honest, I'd probably put myself in that category. Neutrality is hard for me. What is the importance of neutrality when we're speaking with our kids as parents, right? Stepping out of the classroom for a minute. And how do we do it?
So I think the parent to child relationship doesn't dictate as much neutrality as the teacher to student relationship does. Because, I mean, one of the reasons we have kids is so that we can impart our values on them. We like create little beings that hopefully see the world in similar ways that we do. I think what becomes tricky in political things is that they are growing up in a world that is different than the one that we grew up in. Our experiences that we lived are different than the ones that they have. And so they might come to different conclusions than we do. And that's okay. And something that I like to caution parents about, if they're trying to say, like, I want that my child to be in the same party as I do. Fine, you can want that. But emerging research shows that the likelihood that you get that is basically a coin toss because sometimes you can, inculcate your kids with your beliefs and they'll agree and be like, yes, me too. And other times they'll rebel and they'll say, like, actually, my parents see this in a totally wild, wacky way. I'm going the other side. And so that's not really the game here. It's not raising little Democrats or raising little Republicans. It's raising little kids who understand the systems that they're going to graduate into and they can pick the players they want. Like parties change, policies change, personalities change, and we just need to give them the footing so that they can say, this is working for me or this isn't. Not here's how I have to think about this issue or here's the belief system that dictates which party I'm going to like. That's not even functional. It's better to let them kind of like figure it out on their own, but give them the rules.
Yeah. I mean, I love the way of thinking about that. So, and I want to dive into some ideas for different age groups and how we do that a little bit. But before we do that, what are some, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit about ways that we can share our values, right? Because values play intimately into politics, that we can share those values, talk about those values, especially right now. I mean, we are in the midst of a really polarized country in general, but the presidential race in particular has some strong values coming up on both sides. So how do we talk about those values without just desperately portraying or conveying to our kids that we want them to think the way that we think?
Well, I think you can square with them and be like, here is why I see it this way. That's not saying you have to see it this way. You can say, here is why I see it this way. And I think it's important, especially if you have kids who are like 15 to 19 who have like sort of their own budding political awareness. They're trying to like grow up into adults, make sense of their world. I think it's important to ask them what they have heard about an issue. And it's not necessarily what do you think or what's your opinion. It's just what have you heard? Because they are going to get information that is different than you and I are going to get, just like our algorithmic media diets mean like we're seeing and hearing different things. And when you have this opportunity to talk to them about whatever issue it is, and you say, here's where I'm at, it's important to also ask them, what are they hearing? Because they're probably hearing different things. And it's better if you like kind of know the sort of like ecosystem that they're in, because then you can kind of have that discussion in a richer way. Because otherwise you're sort of just like blindly saying what you think. And that doesn't give them sort of the agency to say, like, well, here's kind of where I'm coming from, or here's what I'm hearing right now.
Yeah, I talk in a lot of different contexts about the power of curiosity when it comes to our kids. And you just kind of highlighted that we have to get really curious in this space as well. And it does make for better, deeper, richer conversations.
And connections. It is a way for us to know our kids. It is a way for them to know us. It is a way for us to refine our own views on politics because they will bring you things that you haven't thought about, or they'll see things in ways that you haven't seen them. And I think like saying that that's a good thing makes sense to me because we want to know our kids well. We want them to know us well. And to say that there's a topic that's off limits because it's like too old or it's political or whatever, that doesn't make sense. That's a way to not know your kids and for them to not know you.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that this can be a tool for connection and especially because so many of us think of talking about politics as something that disconnects people, right? And that we can actually flip that idea on its head.
I think so, yes.
So let's talk a little bit. Well, actually, before I do that, I have one more question that I'd love to ask about sort of, how we get our kids involved. And I think in many cases, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself, my husband and I will, we're making dinner at night and, we will have seen the headlines or read some articles throughout the day. And so we'll be discussing an issue and not necessarily intentionally involving our children in that. Is it enough for our kids to just hear us talking about politics, or do we need to do more?
I don't know that I would say it's enough if you want your kids to like fully understand how to participate, but I would say it is better than not talking at all. And I think what's important for us to consider when we're doing this sort of work in front of our kids is to not be overly negative because they get so many messages that like politics is bad and the people in it are egomaniacs and stuff. And so I think part of our job as parents when talking to each other or talking to other adults is to point out the bright spots. Like if you have clean drinking water, politics had a hand in it. If you have nice roads, someone in local government, state government, or a federal committee had a nice hand in it. And so I think we have to like kind of be cognizant of our role because they look up to us for what we do and what we don't do. And if we're all just like complaining all the time, they're going to think that's how we approach this topic. And so if they don't want to talk to us about it and all you're going to be able to do is talk to someone else in front of them, that's fine. I don't know that I'd say it's enough, but it is better than not doing it at all.
Okay, fair point. And I love that you said that we need to not just be complaining, because I think that's often what we do, right? Oh my gosh, did you hear that, whatever it is, right? Can you believe that, whatever, again, whatever it might be, it's really easy to, and the media just invites us to do that, right? To focus on the negative. And as you were saying that, I'm like, well, no wonder they don't think politics is something they want to get involved in if all they're hearing from us is how terrible it is.
Yeah, and it's not just us in the media. It's even like children's programming. Oftentimes we'll have someone who's like a mayor character, and like at best they're like a bumbling doofus and they like kind of like don't get things right. And at worst, they're out to do harm to their city. And so like they get these messages in every direction. And so it's not surprising to me that when I get them, they're like, "Oh, politics is stupid and I hate it." And it's like, okay, well, you've been hearing that since you were born in every way that you can. And so that's sort of part of this argument too, is like there are some things that politics does well. Like we do have some things to celebrate, and we just need to look for them and make sure that our kids know it too.
Yeah. In the parenting context, I often talk about the idea that what we focus on grows. And it strikes me that that really matters here too, that if we focus on some of those positives, we'll see more of the positives.
I think that's right because it's something to work towards. It's like it's possible. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's then like break it down a little bit. I've got a 7-year-old at home. I also have a 15-year-old. The ways that I can discuss these kinds of things with them are different. I was thinking about this, 4 years ago during the last presidential election, my older kiddo was 11. So again, a really different um, age group and sort of level of understanding. So let's start for those parents with younger children, roughly ages 5 to 9. What are some recommendations you can make for engaging them? Because one of the things I so appreciate about this book is you say, and you lay out very clearly, we don't have to wait till they're teenagers.
I think that's right. We don't because no one else is waiting. They are getting the messaging. So for 5 to 9 year olds, everyone sort of understands their kids best and what sort of things that interest them. There's sometimes you'll get kids who are like really into systems. So these are kids that maybe like video games where they're like building communities or they're building like structures and stuff. You can go deep on politics and like congressional hearings and stuff like that. You can do that if you want. But for most kids, the personalities are kind of what is attractive. And so there's plenty of books that talk about, who the president is. But I think something that's even better is to humanize politics by letting them meet someone who's in their politics. And I'll give you an example that I'm actually really excited about. I have a niece who's 7, and we were away on vacation in July. And she was like, "Aunt Lindsay, I don't know who my mayor is." And I was like, "Well, you know what, Piper? I don't know who your mayor is either, but let's go find out." So we got online, we found out who her mayor was, and we sent him an email together. Like her and I sat there, I typed it out, and we were talking about it. And I said, "Look, I'm going to be in your town in the next few months. My niece is a constituent of yours. She's never met you. Do you think we could set up a meeting?" And in a week's time, he was like, "Yes, we can." And so her parents are like very excited. She's going to go meet the mayor. And that's something where they just see politics is not this amorphous like body out in DC doing stuff behind closed doors that you don't know about. A lot of it is your neighbors. A lot of it is people who are in your community, in your state, trying hard to see what the good life can be and thinking they can do a little bit more to make that happen. And so that's something that I think young kids can get excited about. Is just show them the people. Like let them see who's doing this. They're not going to understand, like in a primary election, like they're not going to get that.
Right.
But they can be excited about the people who do this work.
I love that idea. The neighborhood that I live in participates in National Night Out, which is, a block party essentially for us, but you can also invite the
And is
local
it's hosted by
community
police?
Yeah, it's community
Yes.
responders. So the fire department, first aid, police, and I guess those are the ones that will come if you invite them. And these kids were so excited to meet like the chief of the fire department, and there was a school resource officer that was there, and they loved it. And I know that's not, the mayor's office, but it's another aspect of government, right?
It's government. It is. And that's something where, we do have a lot of stuff where we like the helpers, we like the police, we like the firemen. I think something that we don't recognize is they do not have their roles without the bureaucrats, without the politicians. Those are all parts of that piece. And usually people who are like local politicians, they want to meet as many people as they can. So if you invite them to that sort of stuff, they'll usually come because they know that their election margins turn on small numbers. So I
Yeah.
think it's great if you kind of like fold them into that thing.
Oh, I love that idea. I love that. Okay, as they get a little bit older, that sort of 10 to 14, and as I said, my older daughter was in that bucket 4 years ago, during the last presidential election. And I frankly don't think we did a great job. She was 11, at really explaining to her what was going on and why and the impact. She saw frustrations, she saw joy, like she saw all of that from us, but we didn't provide the context. So how do we start as they hit those sort of tween and early teen years? How do we bump up the level of our conversation?
Yeah, so that's something where I would say this for 5 to 9 as well, but certainly at that like 10 to 14 is take them when you vote. Like if you have a state where you go vote in person, make sure that they see what that tradition looks like. So they kind of understand like, ooh, this is everyone coming together making a choice. It's sort of like that collective decision making. And if you live in a state where you have like mail ballots as your norm, that can be something that happens at the dinner table together. And as they start to get to that older age, I kind of like the idea of turning some of your kids and being like, you can be our family researcher. Can you go find out the people in these races or can you go do this sort of thing? Because 10-year-olds aren't going to be able to do that, but 14-year-olds can. And they sort of like the responsibility of like, let me go see these things. And, if we have ubiquitous information on this, it just takes looking for it. And so those are like sort of ways you can kind of get them involved, but you're not really like asking them to hold too much in their brain. They're not having to like memorize things, but it kind of shows them the concepts. It shows them like this is a bunch of people casting a ballot. Our votes matter in this way, depending on if it's, presidential electoral college or if it's your house race. And just give them those little concepts so that they can build. And then by the time they get to those classes, they'll have a better understanding because they're exposed, where most kids just aren't exposed to that.
Yeah. What a great idea to have them do some of the research, because I'm a pretty committed voter and I try to vote in every election that we have, and we do have mail in voting in Washington. Um, and I go through the voter pamphlet and I read the recommendations from various news sources and try to do my research. But I do that in the privacy of my office during my workday typically.
Yeah, but I mean, the campaigns happen on so many mediums now. You can send a 14-year-old, they'll go find a YouTube, they'll find something that's maybe an Instagram or wherever they're sort of seeing stuff. And campaigns have content there. And they have their own internal barometers for what they like and what they don't like. And they don't usually know about what the parties represent. So they can say, like this candidate said this, it was great, or I really didn't like how she presented that. Whatever, but they get to interact with those things and see how people campaign for things. What are persuasive tactics? What are not persuasive tactics? And that's an important skill to develop.
Yeah, love it. All right, then our older teens, which, as I've said, I've got one, and she cares about stuff, right? She cares about many of the issues. How do I help her go from caring about the issues to feeling empowered to get involved in them in the political sense, even if it's just, quote unquote, just voting?
Yeah, that's the fundamental thing, though. The fundamental thing is they need to understand how to register to vote and when they can do it. In some states, you can pre-register at 16. In some states, it's 17. In every state, by the time you're 18, you can register to vote. So that is like the fundamental thing that they have to figure out. And if they move away for college, I would encourage them to register where they live instead of trying to come back to vote on a Tuesday at their hometown because they just don't want to do it. But there's also something that a lot of communities, like local elected officials, will have something like a youth committee board or some sort of like consortium of kids, and they'll ask them questions about like, what do you think about high schools or public spaces or our parks? And those are things that not every kid's going to really want to do, but to make sure that they understand that's an option, because that's a way to really participate in your local community. And I think it staves off some of the really challenging things that we find with our teens, which is like isolation or loneliness, kind of due to like an utilization of social media. Local politics turns on like the repeated routine interaction of people with a purpose. So if you can show them, here's some outlets, here's some ways that we do that, that's great. In the book, I go through like 5 things that I think your kids have to know before they leave your house, and it's simple. They need to know how to register to vote. They need to know the difference between primaries and general elections, because oftentimes, increasingly throughout the United States, the election that matters is the primary. Like whoever wins that, depending on how the seats shaped, they're going to win the general election. They need to understand federalism. State does different things than the local government does. Federal government does different things. And both of those, they need to get that. They need to understand the Constitution, which is kind of a tall order, but it's really not that hard and kind of interesting to read it as a family, not in one night, but over the course of 4 years. And then the last thing is they need to understand it's okay to have uncomfortable conversations and they have to be practiced in it. Because by the time I get them as college students, they're nervous. They don't want to have hard conversations because they themselves don't want to feel uncomfortable. They don't want to put anyone else into discomfort. And we don't get things done if we don't talk about them. So that's something that's like an ongoing thing that before they leave your house, they need to have practice in that.
That is such a good list. I mean, it's a hefty list. There's a
It
lot
is.
in there, but it's such a good list that sort of, 5 things that kind of we could check off and say, okay, we've talked about these, and then hopefully through the course of talking about those other things, we've also taught them how to have some of those difficult conversations.
They'll just be so much farther ahead of their peers. They'll be more rooted in the systems that they're in. They're going to understand things better. Hopefully the temperature is down on like if stuff feels really dire, it's like, oh no, I kind of get what I'm doing here. And that's what I think we all want for our kids. We want them to feel stable and secure and safe and efficacious. And it's hard for them to do that on their own. So we kind of have to help them here.
Yeah, love it. Lindsey, this is a conversation. I mean, this book is so full of good stuff. And I feel like this is a conversation that we could carry on for another couple of hours. But what I'd love to, well, first of all, I would love for people to understand that this book is so helpful. I found it so helpful. It's not your typical parenting book, right? It's not like how to deal with them if they have a tantrum. It's how do we literally raise engaged citizens. And it's not written, and I think you've sort of said this, but it's not written from the perspective of how do we raise little Democrats or how do we raise little Republicans? It's how do we raise an engaged group of constituents?
That's right.
Yeah, love it. For those parents who are listening to this and sort of thinking, okay, this is good, I want to get started. What is, aside from getting your book, of course, what's the best place you would say for parents to start if they're like, I just don't know that much. I want to get my kids engaged. I don't know where to begin.
I mean, the internet has so many points of information on this. On my website, which is just simply howtoraisecitizen.com, I have a resources tab and it kind of spells out, what are you interested in? If you're thinking about how like money flows in politics, here's some resources for this. If you're thinking about like, how do you run for things? Here's resources. But really, there are so many places online. We have a lot of information on this. You just have to be willing to take it on. And that's the challenge is like, are we wanting to take this on? I think we should.
Yeah, I think we should too. We're all exhausted, overwhelmed. And this is the stuff that really in the end matters. Yeah.
It is. Our quality of life is decided in political realms. The things that we need to have collective decision making on are better if we know how to make those decisions, if we know how to participate. And so, yes, it's on top of the list of everything else we have to do as parents. But I do think it's consequential, and hopefully it makes the rest of our life easier because we'll get outcomes that we like.
Love it. Love it. Lindsey, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. We will make sure that in our show notes, people can access the book, they can get on your website, and that they know all the places to engage with this fabulous content. I am so glad that you took this on as a project. It has helped me as a parent, and I know that there are other parents who will also be helped by this.
Well, thank you very much. I had a really nice time talking with you.
Yeah, thank you. Everyone, I hope that was so helpful to you and that it was as sort of eye-opening and interesting and groundbreaking for you as it was for me. I know that the conversations that I'm going to be having with my daughters over the next couple of months are going to be different than they might have otherwise, right? They might be a little less rah, my team. And work to be a little bit more like, let's just talk about the process and what's going on and, sort of how this all happens. I would love to be able to take my daughters with me to vote. In Washington State, where I live, everything is mail-in voting, which makes it super easy and increases our engagement. But it does take a little bit of the fanfare away from it. So I can't take them with me, but I often fill out my ballot sort of in my office in secrecy, and I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to engage my girls in the process, and I hope that you do the same. If you do a mail-in ballot, include your children. If you go to the ballot box, take them with you. It's such an important thing for them to see and to start getting engaged in. And if they will be 18 on the day of the election, get them registered now. All right, thank you so much for joining us. You know, as I sign off today, I want to mention one more thing, and that you're going to hear me talk about this more and more. And if you're on my my mailing list and get my newsletter, you'll see more of this. But the U.S. Surgeon General just came out recently with a report, a statement, pretty alarming report indicating or talking about how much parents are struggling right now. We are overworked, underpaid, especially if you're, a stay-at-home parent. We are exhausted, and we're not getting a lot of support, especially from our companies and in other parts of our culture. If you're one of those parents, I hope that this podcast proves supportive or feels supportive to you in doing all the things that we want to do well as parents. But if you need a little more and you'd like to get direct support from me, where at least 3 times a month you can show up and have me answer questions about what's going on in your family, the Heartful Parent Academy is an affordable, super cost-effective, heck of a bargain solution for you. And you can learn more at my website at theheartfulparent.com. Click on the Heartful Parent Academy and you can join for only $27 a month there. Would love to see you inside. We have great conversations, super supportive parents, and lots of different ways of supporting you. All right, on that note, I hope you have a great week. I hope your dinner table or your breakfast table sees some different conversations happening, and that you start inviting your kids in to the political process. Cheers, everyone.